Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian angle on the burning issues of the day. I saw an article over the weekend that caught my attention in the Washington Post about Ernest Hemingway. As many of you know, Hemingway spent a large portion of his life in Cuba, including after the time that Fidel Castro brought his communist revolution to that island. And of course, that was in the context of the big Cold War scare that the CIA and the Pentagon were inflicting on the American people during that entire time, the whole national security apparatus about how the communists were coming to get us and how the communist regime in Cuba posed a grave threat to, the magic term national security. Well, during this period of time, Hemingway, who loved Cuba, loved the Cuban people, had a home there and spent a large portion of his life there. And of course, as we all know, was spied on by the U.S. government, by the national security apparatus, apparently because they believed that anybody that would maintain close ties with a Cold War rival or a Cold War enemy was suspect, was somebody that needed to be watched over. And so this whole controversy that we're having over privacy in this country, it's tempting to think that, oh, this all just came as a result of 9/11 because instead of the communists coming to get us, it's the terrorists coming to get us. But actually, these kind of violations of liberty and privacy go back all the way to the Cold War. And specifically are rooted in the whole national security state apparatus that was grafted onto our original governmental system at the end of World War II, and which fundamentally altered America's governmental system and fundamentally altered America's culture and way of life. Well, Hemingway provides a really good example of how the state operates when it starts monitoring people. They were closely watching him, and what was interesting is that Hemingway knew they were watching him, and it's hard to believe that they would not know that. I mean, these are professionals, but they knew that if Hemingway went and told anybody, "Hey, I think I'm being monitored. I think they're putting me under surveillance," they knew that the average American, especially back then, would say, "Oh, Ernest, you're just suffering from paranoia. We're going to have to send you to the doctors. That the government doesn't watch people and so forth." And well, that's precisely what Ernest Hemingway did. He started telling people, "I think I'm being monitored. I think I'm being watched." And of course, the natural reaction was what I outlined, that people thought, "Oh, he's gone off the deep end. The government doesn't do these types of things." Well, the end result of this whole thing was that Hemingway gets committed to an institution where he undergoes shock therapy. Now, it's hard for me to imagine that the CIA or whatever government agency it was that was monitoring him, FBI or whatever, was not aware that he had been institutionalized for paranoia and that he was actually going to receive shock treatments. Now, don't you think that any government agency would step forward at that point and say, "Hey, wait a minute. This is an American citizen. The guy's got a point. He saw us. We were monitoring him. He doesn't need the shock treatments. He doesn't need to be institutionalized." That's not what they did. They instead kept everything secret, all their surveillance secret, and proceeded to let the whole shock therapy thing go forward with Hemingway. I mean, it just boggles the mind. In fact, my hunch is that they were probably sitting back and laughing about it, thinking that they had achieved a great, achievement here of putting Hemingway under surveillance, letting him see what was going on, knowing that if he went and told anybody, they'd think he was crazy, which is precisely what happened. So I got a feeling they got a good kick out of this thing. And of course, later Hemingway ends up, after he goes to the shock therapy and stuff, he ends up committing suicide. Now, people may say, "Well, Jacob, there's all kinds of institutions in society. They're collecting data on people, all the department stores and the credit card companies and the doctors and so forth. And they throw government in there as if it's all just one great big happy family, with government is the big brother in the family. But actually, there is an enormous distinction between the information that's being gathered by private companies of our personal lives and that of the government. You see, because the government does bad things to people. I mean, they compile this information for one primary purpose. And in fact, this was pointed out in a recent article, I think it was in the New York Times, about China's national security state. Now, what was interesting about this, and I blogged on this last week, is that China has a national security state too. I mean, that's their form of government, a national security state. And the article pointed that out. Well, that's interesting because the United States, since World War II, its basis has been a national security state too. Now, that should give everybody, pause, cause everybody to pause, and should give everybody a cause for concern, because this is a communist totalitarian dictatorship that is founded on the national security establishment. Here we've got a democratic system that is founded on the national security establishment. The article points out that the Chinese officials are very upfront about this thing, is that they want a national security establishment to maintain their grip on power within China itself. So it's the way that they monitor people, they put people under surveillance, they subject people to different controls, they watch the internet, and everything is designed so that they can maintain their grip on power. And what was interesting is that the author of the article, the New York Times, he was sort of implicitly trying to distinguish the American national security state from that of the Chinese by suggesting that, well, over here we have a national security state to deal with terrorism and things like this, and it doesn't have anything to do with the grip on power. But of course, that's just naive, and it's just false. It's delusionary. The reason that there is a national security state in the United States is to maintain that national security apparatus, maintain its grip on power. Because I don't think anyone would deny that this national security branch of the government, and really that's what it is, the Pentagon, the NSA, the CIA, elements of the executive branch, the FBI, that all of this forms really what is essentially the fourth branch of government. It serves as a counterweight to the other three branches of government. And those of you who've been watching this show for a while know that I've referred to a book that really highlights this in a really perfect fashion. It's called National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. I really recommend you take a look at that book. And Glennon points out that with the establishment of the national security establishment, that it ended up with virtually 98% of the power. He doesn't use that number, but that's the point, is that all the power in Washington is now based in the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, but they permit the other three branches to maintain the aura that they're still in control, like they were when the government was established with the Constitution. So you got the judicial branch and the executive branch and the congressional branch, but really all the power, really the real power, is centered in the national security branch. And so all these things like surveillance and the power to assassinate and the power to torture and to round up people, ultimately this is all about the same thing as it is in China, maintaining the grip on power of this entire huge apparatus, the national security state apparatus. And so there's a big distinction with private companies and the government, because you see, with private companies, I never worry about private companies getting my data. They want me to fill out forms and stuff. It doesn't matter to me whether a department store has personal information about me or whether my doctor does, because they're never going to do bad things to me. You see, the department store is not going to come and initiate force against me. They're not going to put me in jail. They're not going to round me up. They're not going to torture me. I mean, they're going to use this data for something, like to promote their advertising or to marketing campaign, who to target and so forth. And there's always a choice here. You see, if people don't want to divulge their information to private companies, nobody's forced to do that. You can just back off. You can cancel credit cards if that's the way you want to live your life, or you can just decline to do business with people that don't maintain strict rules on privacy. But notice how the market's developed in this sense, where they have privacy commitments now that private companies are making to customers because they know it's important to customers, and they do their best to protect credit card information. And so you, through the competitive process, the consumer ultimately is sovereign, and he says, if I'm going to give this up to you, here are the conditions. And if those conditions are met, like I say, the customer can just walk away and say, hey, I'm not doing business with that company, or I'm not going to buy anything online. So there's always choices to be made. With the government, no one's got a choice. I mean, they imposed this massive super secret surveillance scheme on us without telling us. There wasn't a choice here. They didn't go to the elected representatives of the people in Congress and say, we want to enact this huge surveillance scheme where everybody's data is going to be compiled. They didn't do that. I mean, that shows you the power. Notice that nothing happened to them. When Edward Snowden released all this information, nothing happened to these people. So why are they compiling all this data? Well, they're saying, well, it's to keep people safe. Well, that's one of the ruses that's always been used for taking away people's freedom. I mean, this is a time-honored ruse. We don't learn about it in public schools because, they're not going to teach something like that in government schools. Something you got to start learning on your own, through self-education, that this is what totalitarian regimes are all about. I mean, this is what the Gestapo was all about. Monitoring people, spying on people. This is what Castro's dictatorship is all about. I mean, they have little spies in the neighborhoods, and they have neighborhood watch people where they're supposed to disclose anything to the government that is unusual. And so it's a surveillance society. And why is it a surveillance society under the Gestapo and under Castro and under China and the Soviet Union? Well, because that's the way they maintain control. That as soon as somebody starts to question the apparatus, all of a sudden, okay, let's mark this down. And if it starts to get out of hand, we'll just smash it down. And that's what they do. I mean, that's the history of suppression of dissent. And so they're hoping that everybody either stays quiet, or that if somebody does start to protest, that it doesn't get too much attention. If it starts to get attention, then they just suppress it, put it down in some way or another. They go after the person, and it inevitably alters the way a person operates. If you think, I've even seen libertarians say, "What's the big deal? I got nothing to hide. If you got nothing to hide, shouldn't care if the government's watching you." Well, we've posted some fantastic articles over the past several years where people have talked about the importance of this principle of privacy. That it really is a core principle in a free person's life. That you can't have a free society in which government is monitoring everybody's activity, because it inevitably affects your behavior. If you think people are listening into from the government or listening into your telephone calls, that's going to affect what you say on the telephone to anyone. Now, you may have some innocuous calls where you're calling to get some information about what movie is showing or whatever, but even that would make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, like, what business of the government is it of what movie you're going to see? So inevitably, when you're talking to your friends, when you're writing emails, the minute you're thinking that somebody's watching you and reading what you're doing, that affects your behavior. And how can you be free in a spiritual sense, a psychological sense, when somebody's constantly monitoring you? I mean, those of you that have read 1984 by George Orwell, you get that sense of where somebody's constantly watching everybody. No matter what you do, they're watching you. And that inevitably affects your behavior. Now, they have this system, at least when Hemingway was around, where they could surveil people, and the average American would say, "Oh, that's just not possible. That doesn't happen in America. You must be suffering from paranoia." And we all heard it. Remember when in the 60s or something, we'd make jokes about, "Oh, the government's watching us, the CIA's watching us," and somebody said, "Oh, you're suffering from paranoia," Well, now we know, at least in today's times, that nobody suffers from paranoia that thinks the government might be watching them, because the government is watching everyone. I mean, that's what the secret surveillance scheme that Snowden was disclosing was all about. Now, they claimed, that it was just data, that this person calls this person and that's it. They're not monitoring the telephone conversations. Can you believe that, though? I mean, does anybody really believe that they're not, recording telephone conversations too? Because we all know they'd lie about it. That as long as somebody hasn't disclosed it and it's still secret, they're going to lie about it. That's just the way they operate. And the reason they're so mad at Snowden is that he released the information about the data collection, so they had to start talking about it. Now, why? Let's just think about the data itself. Let's take a CEO of a major company. He's got lots of money, he's got a lot of influence, and he decides that this whole deal of the national security establishment, standing army, NSA is just a bunch of bull. That it has no place in a free society. That is destroying our country. Not only with the out of control spending that the whole thing involves, the whole standing military, the CIA, all the troops, the interventions. I mean, let's face it, the country's going bankrupt just like Greece has with its out of control spending. And let's say the CEO figures this all out and says, you know what, I'm going to join up with the Libertarians and I'm going to take a public stand against foreign interventionism. I'm going to take a public stand against the national security establishment. I'm going to start calling for a dismantling of this thing, an abolition of the CIA. But it just so happens that, say, 5 years ago, he was unfortunately, let's say hypothetically, engaged in an affair. Let's say the man's married. And so he knows that there's a bunch of telephone calls that he made to the woman he was having the affair with. What are the chances that that man is going to join up with the Libertarians and take a public stand against the national security establishment and all its beloved foreign interventions that, of course, produce all the threat of terrorism, which they then use to take away our freedoms? I mean, what are the chances he's going to stand up against this racket? The chances are virtually nil, because he knows that they've got all these records. Even if they haven't recorded the telephone conversations between he and that woman, he knows they have all the telephone records that could be easily leaked out to the press in some nice little sophisticated manner. And so what does he do when a reporter calls and says, I'm just curious, how do you explain all these telephone calls? Well, he's not going to take that kind of chance. He's going to say, not worth it to me. I'm just going to lie low. And so that while they're saying, oh, well, this whole surveillance scheme is to keep people safe, really what it is to keep people down, to keep people cowed and in fear of what they're going to disclose with all these secret things that they've been doing. I mean, that's how they maintain their grip on power. Now, notice when they put the big apparatus like this in play, the person that they're addressing, they're supposedly addressing it to, like the terrorist figures it out right away. He says, okay, they're recording telephone calls or keeping data. He figures out a way around it. I mean, he's not going to do something where he's certain that they're going to be able to catch him. And so the apparatus, though, stays in place, even though the bad guys are now circumventing it because they're not stupid. The apparatus stays in place, and guess who it ensnares? It snares all the innocent people, the people that are not engaged in the terrorist attacks. And of course, like my hypothetical CEO example, an example of this is with former Congressman Hastert. That here they've got all these structuring laws, bank structuring laws that they've had in place for the drug war and the war on terrorism, where if you take out a certain amount of money or deposit a certain small quantities of money, and they'll come after you for what are called structuring, that you should be making your $500,000 withdrawal all at once, and then they can report it to the authorities. But what Hastert apparently was doing was making smaller withdrawals that would total a large amount of money. Now that law was passed because to catch drug dealers or terrorists and so forth. And so they come to Hastert and say, oh, well, why were you doing this? So see, it's a classic example is that once the terrorists figure out that they've got these laws and they're monitoring, reporting requirements, they figure out a way around it. But it ensnares this guy, Hastert, who apparently has been paying off a guy that he had molested many years ago. Now, I got no problems with going after a guy for child molestation. I mean, I think a guy should get prosecuted for that. But there's something sordid about this whole thing of using a structuring law that was designed to catch terrorists and drug dealers that catches a guy that's paying off bribe payments to the guy who he had presumably molested in order to keep him quiet. And I think it totaled in the millions of dollars that Hassert was paying it. Now, whatever you may think of bribery or whatever, I mean, that was something between him and the victim. But for the government to get involved in structuring law, so imagine who else they're monitoring. And a lot of these people that have been ensnared in this structuring violations have been non-drug dealers and non-terrorists, people who just, for whatever reason, have good reasons as far as their business goes. They're trying to keep their affairs private, they're taking money out in smaller quantities or making deposits in smaller quantities. And a lot of them are doing it just for privacy. They don't want the government to find out what they're making. And why should the government know what a person's doing with his money? Why is that any business of the government? But we're so accustomed to these violations of financial privacy and the bank reporting requirements that we've all been taught that this is part of a free society. They have the same thing in China. They have the same thing in Cuba. They got the same thing in North Korea. I mean, this structure, this whole surveillance scheme, NSA, CIA, standing military, this is inherent to totalitarian regimes. And so that brings us to really what we need to do about this. And so you've got, you had the expiration of the Patriot Act, which was fantastic. I mean, it was just a ridiculous, inane assault on the freedom and privacy of the American people. I mean, they call it the Patriot Act so that, the average person goes to public schools and says, oh, well, it's got Patriot in its name. I'm a patriot, and I guess I better support it. He doesn't think through what's going on. It's just a vehicle for controlling people, infringing on people, maintaining their grip on power. And so repealing it was great, but what do? They come up with an even more inane name, the USA Freedom Act, which was just like a reform. Well, it really doesn't matter what they do and what they call it or whatever, because as long as the NSA exists, it's going to do whatever is necessary. It thinks it's necessary to protect national security. The two-word term that is like magic in America. Let's face it, it's the national religion. National security is the national religion and has been for decades of the American people. And so whatever they think they need to get done to protect national security, they're going to do it. They don't care that the Freedom Act is telling them don't do this or some law tells them not to do that. If national security requires it, they don't consider, they say the law is not a suicide pact. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and they're in charge of protecting national security. And nothing ever happens to them anyway when they're caught violating these laws. I mean, look, you've got the kidnapping that CIA agents did in Italy. They were convicted over there of that felony. Nothing happens to them. You had the execution of Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi at the hands of the U.S. national security establishment in Chile in the 70s. No investigation, no prosecution. When Mrs. Horman, Charles Horman's wife, sues, the federal courts throw her out on her ear, won't let her take one deposition because of the power of that national security establishment. When the telecoms were caught illegally partnering with the national security establishment and giving away all their customer records, nothing happened to them. They ended up getting immunity from both civil and criminal prosecution. And so they know, look, torture. I mean, how many people have been prosecuted for torture? So, and assassination, we've got assassinations of people, and nobody gets sued, nobody gets prosecuted because of this power that the national security establishment has within our federal governmental system. Well, if they're not going after people for those things, I can guarantee you they're never going to go after some NSA official or officials for violating people's privacy. And so all these reform acts and acts to rein in the NSA and the CIA and the military, they're ridiculous because you still have to operate and live your life under the assumption that they're watching you, that they're monitoring your email, that they're recording your telephone call. You'd be stupid not to, because that's their system. And so really, there's really only one solution. And this is a solution that many libertarians just don't get. They understand the economic aspects of economic liberty and so forth, and they've studied Austrian economics, but they don't understand that the real infringement on freedom, the biggest infringement on freedom, is on the national security state side, the warfare state side. Because as long as these institutions exist, like I say, they will do whatever is necessary, in their own opinion, to protect national security. If that involves kidnapping, assassination, roundups, tortures, coups, assassinations, they're going to do it because that's what they see their job is. And as long as you live under a totalitarian-like apparatus like this, there is no way that you can consider yourself free. Now, the Chinese people understand that. The Cuban people, most of them understand that. The people in the Soviet Union understood that. But the American people don't understand that, except libertarians, and even then, only some libertarians. That you can't have freedom when you're living under a totalitarian type of apparatus. And that's attached onto the governmental system. And that's what it was in 1947. This whole system of the National Security Council, this big standing military, the overseas military empire, the CIA, the NSA comes into existence a few years later in 52. That all of this is grafted on, it immediately becomes the center of power in the federal government, and it fundamentally alters our way of life. So the upshot of all this is that the reform game is a fool's errand. That anybody that pretends that they're reforming the NSA or reforming the CIA, it's ridiculous. You will never have a free society with these agencies in existence. So if you want a free society, and that's what libertarians are all about, we're about freedom, there's only one solution to this, and that is to dismantle these things. These are Cold War dinosaurs. They've of course transformed it from the war on communism to the war on terrorism, but that's just because their policies went out and started poking hornets' nests in the Middle East after they lost the Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, and they were freaking out like, what do we do now? Because we libertarians were saying, hey, time to now dismantle this whole thing. I mean, it was a Cold War apparatus. I never believed it was necessary in the first place. I mean, heck, you got the military right now making friends with North Vietnam. They just entered into a defense understanding. Can you imagine? I mean, what does that mean? That we're going to come to the defense of Vietnamese communism? But it really goes to show you that there never needed to be a Cold War, that there could have been peaceful coexistence, not with the Pentagon entering into partnerships with communist regimes as they just did, but simply by the government staying out of it and peacefully coexisting. If Cuba's got a communist regime, okay, that's not a good thing for people in Cuba, but it's no business of the U.S. government. And it's certainly no reason to start monitoring and surveilling the American people. And so that's really the only solution to this thing. And that's what needs to be emphasized, is that if we're going to think at a higher level of what do we want out of life, do we want freedom in this country or not? Then we've got to think not only in terms of the assaults on freedom that the welfare state brings us, including the IRS, but also the tremendous assault, much bigger assault that the warfare state brings us, and why the only solution is to take this Cold War dinosaur, including NATO or the U.S. National Security States partnership in NATO, and dismantle the whole thing. That's the key to a free society, to a peaceful society, to a harmonious society, where you liberate the private sector, liberate the American people to travel to Cuba, spend money there, travel to Korea, North Korea, to China, wherever. But rein in the government, dismantle that fourth branch of government, restore three branches of government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, and rein it in with limited powers. And so, well, if you don't have a national security establishment, if you don't have a huge military, then they can't go out and provoke all these crises that they love provoking. Like they're provoking one with China right now because they're losing the impetus from the war on terrorism, because they're not killing as many people in the Middle East anymore and in Afghanistan. And so there's always these crises. And notice that every time there's a crisis, notice that the U.S. is over there poking hornet's nest. Well, once you dismantle this machine, not only are no more hornet's nest poked, but they don't have the military means to go out and get America involved in these foreign wars and foreign interventions. But most important, all of a sudden people have a sense of what real freedom is all about. It's about this sense of privacy and living your life without thinking that the government's monitoring you and watching you the way Ernest Hemingway was living his life. And man, that's no guarantee that there won't be a stray government official, but when they don't have the apparatus in place with the huge NSA and the huge bureaucracy, because believe me, these people aren't going to work for free. That when you don't have this huge apparatus of the standing military and the NSA and the CIA, all of a sudden there's a sense of freedom. Wow, I can live my life without thinking that the government's monitoring my email, my phone calls. I can talk to people without looking around the corner and so forth. And that's the key to a free society. And that's why we continue raising people's vision to that higher level. Forget reform. It's a fool's game. The only way to achieve that free society is by dismantling these departments and agencies, not only the welfare state side of things, but the warfare state side of things. That's this week's Libertarian Angle. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week.